Well, hello everyone. I'm giving you a peek, a free preview episode into one of my other channels that you might not be aware of. And I'm going to do this for a few others. Normally this would just go out early to my patrons, but I'm giving it to all of you because there's a libertarian tie-in to it. Well, I do a word and etymology show called Jurassic Dictionary, where we deal with unusual, dying, dead, those kinds of just interesting, rare words, particularly if they have a historical spin. So, watch this next episode. It is about Peculium, and it was a word given to me to take a look at by Stefan Kinsella. And if you happen to enjoy it, please head over to Jurassic Dictionary and give me a subscribe. I'd really appreciate it. And also, if you're one of my patrons, I'm going to stick this up here. You get these episodes about a week ahead of time, along with Pink Parliamentarian and some Pink Flame of Liberty exclusive contact. All right. Did I say contact? Content. Yes, for a word person, I am stumbling a lot, but I hope you enjoy this next show. Well, hello, it is Karen Ann Harlos joining you for another episode of Jurassic Dictionary, where we examine a dead, dying, or just interesting, unusual word. And if that word has a cool historical spin, even the better, because now the word for today is Peculium, and it was brought to me by my friend Stefan Kinsella, who brought us last episode's words, Salatium. And it's going to be really interesting to discuss this word and its connection to modern limited liability corporations. That's something surprising, not something you expect me to say every show. Now, unfortunately, also has deep ties to Roman slavery. So what is peculium? The word derives from Latin pecu, meaning cattle or flock. In ancient Rome, cattle were a primary measure of wealth. Peculium originally referred to a small amount of property or money that a person, often someone without their own full legal rights, was allowed to manage under a form of custodianship or guardianship. Like when we refer to real property held in tenure rather than allodially. The term peculium first appeared in Latin texts around the 3rd century BCE during the Roman Republic as Rome's economy and legal systems grew more complex. It is tied to the early Latin lexicon with roots in even older Indo-European words for wealth and livestock. We see it referenced in legal and literary works by the 2nd century BCE, and its early English use appears around 1609. So just imagine that you are an enslaved craftsman in ancient Rome. Your enslaver gives you a peculium, maybe some coins, tools, or even a small shop. You're allowed to manage this as your own, but here's the catch. There's always a catch, isn't there? It still belongs to your enslaver. If you're savvy, you might just grow that peculium through trade or through your craftsmanship. Now, some enslaved people use their peculium to eventually purchase their freedom, though that was, of course, rare and depended upon their enslaver's goodwill. This concept also extended to family dynamics. Roman sons, even grown ones, were under their father's legal control, called patria potestas. A father might give his son a peculium to manage, like an allowance with strings attached. Friends with benefits. It was a way to teach responsibility while still maintaining ultimate control. The peculium served as a tool for enslavers to motivate their slaves without granting full freedom. It gave slaves a glimmer of autonomy. They could earn, trade, and accumulate wealth within the bounds of their peculium. Now, this wasn't charity, it was smart business. Enslaved people with a peculium often worked harder, hoping, believing that they one day might buy their freedom or manumission, but there were limits. The enslaver, obviously, as we said, could revoke the peculium at any time, and any profits technically belonged to the enslaver. Interestingly, slaves with substantial peculium sometimes, unfortunately, often owned slaves of their own, creating a hierarchy within slavery, and this system also protected the enslaver. If the slave's business ventures led to debts, the enslaver's liability was typically limited to the value of the peculium, much like modern limited liability concepts. So historians note that while manumission via peculium wasn't the norm, most slaves did remain enslaved for life. It was a more common path for skilled urban slaves like artisans or merchants rather than rural laborers. So this highlights the complex, often, yes, I'd say almost always exploitative dynamics of Roman slavery, where economic incentives intertwined with absolute control. Now, there's no direct evidence that the term peculium or its specific Roman legal concept was widely used at all in the context of American chattel slavery. Some practices in American chattel slavery might have bore some similarities to the peculium concept, even if the term itself wasn't used. In some places, enslaved people in the American South were allowed to earn small amounts of money or manage limited resources, often through informal arrangements. For example, skilled artisans like blacksmiths or carpenters, or those working in urban settings, might be permitted to hire out their labor in their spare time, whatever that was, keeping a portion of their earnings. Now, these arrangements were not called peculium, but served a similar purpose, incentivizing labor while maintaining the enslaver's control. On some plantations, enslaved people were given small garden plots or allowed to raise livestock such as chickens to supplement their own rations. They could sometimes sell surplus produce or goods at local markets, thus accumulating small sums of money. There were some rare cases in which enslaved people used earnings from their labor to buy their freedom or the freedom of family members. But unlike Roman slavery, where peculium was a recognized legal concept, American slavery lacked any consistent legal framework for such arrangements. Now, here's where things get really interesting. Peculium has a distant but fascinating connection to modern limited liability corporations, or LLCs. In Roman times, the peculium allowed someone, such as an enslaved person or a son, to manage assets without full ownership. So this created kind of a separation between the manager's action and the legal owner's liability. Does that sound familiar? Certainly does to me, because in a modern LLC, owners or members can manage the assets and conduct business, but their personal liability is limited to the company's debts. Those debts do not automatically become their personal debt. So the company only has the company debts. It doesn't transfer to them personally. The word peculium is tied to other wealth-related terms that we still use. You ever hear of pecuniary? It means related to money and comes from the same Latin root pecu. Now, you won't hear peculium in everyday conversation today. It is a historical curiosity, which is, of course, what I love, but the legacy of it lives on in words like peculiar, which originally meant one's own property before evolving to mean strange or distinctive. But think about it. Calling something peculiar is like saying it is uniquely someone's own, just like a peculium was in Rome. So now it's time to tie this in to my friend Stefan Kinsella, who drew this to my attention because he wrote something called Peculium and the State as Overlord. Here's where libertarianism comes in. It occurred to me that our property and income today is basically merely a peculium, not to be confused with pecunium, since the state presumes the right to take as much of it as they want, leaving a discretionary amount to us serfs at their pleasure. Further proof that taxation enslaves. And that's the end of his quote. It's a worthwhile read getting into that whole article because it gets into issues of land tenure and the fiction of allodial title to land. So what do you think? This was already a long episode. I hope I earned your subscription for this, and I'd really appreciate it. And until we talk next time, paint a more descriptive world. Bye-bye.